afternoon, everyone. It's wonderful to be back with you again. I'm joined by my very good friend and colleague based in Moscow, Russia, Fiorella Isabel. I recommend everybody heading to her Substack to check out her latest article. Can you just give me the title, Fee? Because for some reason I can't close down my screen to access it on the laptop.
Yeah, it's Victory Day, Defeat and Deceit. Russia advances, US cashes in. The orchestrator plays peacemaker.
Yeah, and I read it actually earlier this morning, and I read it again just before we started talking. And I love the way you write. I love the way you express what is such insightful analysis, but always tinged with this personal touch, which I also really appreciate. And this is what I do have to say, this is what is often missing from independent media, YouTube commentators who, to be fair, for whatever reason, maybe it's financial or otherwise, or time pressures, rarely get to go to the regions and the areas that they're talking about. And it does, from experience, it makes a massive difference to your understanding of the nuances, of the complexities. And nothing is ever as straightforward as it appears when you're analyzing based on kind of public statements, everything that is visible, in other words, whether it's in the mainstream media, whether it's statements made by public officials and by governmental institutions and administrations. And I want to start off with your impressions. You went to kind of a pre-victory day, which is May the 9th, tomorrow, right, in Moscow. You went to a pre-victory day concert. And I was really impressed how you described the atmosphere. I just want to start with that to get some kind of context of what we're going to be talking about in reference to your article.
Yeah, so, I tend to quite be rather private in
Mm,
when it comes to what I'm doing, but I did attend a concert with my partner's family, and like many Russians, they've obviously lost people during the Second World War, which
yeah.
to Russians is the Great Patriotic War. It's huge because the Soviet Union, which Russia was the largest part of it, lost 27 million people. And this included,
Mm,
of course, from various countries at that time that were part of the, well, Soviet republics. And this concert will actually be viewed in Russia tomorrow. It was recorded, and I didn't know that when I went there. And it will be showed in Russia at Channel One, I believe, which is like Russia's main channel. And basically, it was just a timeline going from the beginning of the Soviet Union's involvement in towards the end, and even connecting in many ways what is currently happening now. Because if we look back, for example, Kursk, the region that Russia just regained from Ukraine, was also a battle fought in 1943 that the Soviet Union also won against the Nazis. And when you're talking about fighting neo-Nazi fascists, that still exists, not just obviously in Ukraine, but I think in many sectors of our society, especially in the West, in various ways, and of course in Israel. When we talk about this fascistic entity of sorts, there is something that has survived in spite of the fact that Russia today exists as a capitalist country, a country that we've talked about is more pragmatic than ideological, that really doesn't have that sentiment. There's still some remnants of that because, in comparison to Americans from the United States, the Russians understand or at least know their history. They know what happened. They're educated on it. They're instilled as to the importance of this day compared to in the United States, we're actually instilled that, we're the most important center of the universe. And without us, as Donald Trump echoed, the world, stops spinning and nothing else matters. Essentially, that's what you're instilled. All of these lies about how the United States won World War II. And so to see the young people who were basically the ones that were volunteering of sorts in this event and were up there also holding the photos, because this is part of the Immortal Regiment parades that we have seen all over the world recently, and all over literally Europe, and even in Sydney, Australia, you have people just come out who had relatives who perished or who were veterans of World War II, but obviously under the Soviet Union, and they march in the streets and they give this sort of nostalgic honor to what they sacrificed. And so it was very emotional because it was just something that I hadn't really seen, right? Whenever I enter these spaces where it's a different culture, a different people that has endured war that in the US we could not imagine even for one day. It's just impossible. We don't have the ability to comprehend what that would be like. And so whenever this happens to me, I get a sense of just overwhelming like disbelief that so much of the world in the West, specifically in Washington, revolves around just a mountain of deceit, a mountain, an endless mendacity that exists. And it's just it was, you feel guilty in many ways, but you also feel humbled to see that. And you also understand a little bit deeper as to why many people in Russia, despite perhaps the government being far more pragmatic, still have this tie to what the Soviet Union was and what they did, and fighting in the ideological um, for the ideological disaster that is fascism, right? And why some people in the Donbass literally did this in 2014 and urged Putin to go in sooner based on this ideological call. But Russia did not, because they were not in many ways honestly ready, and they didn't want to go into a war at that moment. And so what the images you see, many of these images were real. There were interviews with people that had served or were very young, how that affected them. It wasn't just the war, it was the hunger, it was the lack of supplies, it was the fact that the war essentially encompassed the entire existence, that there was children of war, that all of these things were happening. And for the United States to come in as Johnny come lately and go in there and pretty much export to the world all of our movies about the war and how we won and all of this, you just get a little bit angrier in that sense. And you realize that this is happening again, just in a different theater with different faces. And there's so many layers we could go into on that
Yeah.
as well.
Actually, there's just one thing I want to pick up there, because someone recently asked me, and it's a very pertinent question, but they asked me, because I was talking about the hatred with which Israelis and Zionist youth are indoctrinated from kindergarten upwards. And if anyone wants to verify that, there's a very good documentary called Israelism, which is available to view for free online at their website. And they asked me, yeah, but couldn't you also argue that the Palestinians actually display an equivalent hatred? And it's a very easy question for me to answer, because I've spent time in Gaza, I've spent time with Palestinians in Syria and here in Lebanon. And I have to say, it's very rare that you see hatred. You see a determination to liberate Palestine, to achieve justice for the Palestinian people, to end the occupation, to end the oppression, and the racism and the apartheid. But you rarely see a hatred. You don't see a hatred, for example, of Westerners coming to their country or to their environment. They're welcomed very hospitably, as you experienced in the occupied territories. And you mentioned there that when you witness this, the reality of who or which country made the sacrifices in the Second World War, and here is Trump going on X, laying claim to the victory and effectively trying to write Russia out of history, just as, of course, the UK and the EU and Germany and all of them have been trying to do for some time through, as you said, movies, books, fiction, etc. So when you mention, there is a legitimacy to feeling angry, but did you actually experience any anger in the Russian population during your time there?
No, on the contrary, very much like I've experienced in West Asia, in Lebanon, and when I was there for Nasrallah's funeral, there's not a whole sense where any of these people sit and say, we hate the United States, we hate Americans, we want, Washington to fall into pieces. I mean, I think maybe some individuals might experience that, but I think most of that is coming from people like me, people like Americans and other Westerners who are extremely embarrassed, insulted on behalf of what is being done, in the governments, and also just helpless in so many ways. I think people feel like you could have done more, you could have done something. There's something must be done, especially with everything happening now with the ongoing genocide. And so that all of that comes back, and you're like, well, where's the end? You see the endless involvement of Washington's hands on all of these events that are unfolding or that have unfolded in the past and are now kind of being history is rhyming constantly. And so in Russia, the thing that I've experienced is quite on the contrary. And what I've also seen in Latin America and what I've seen in the global South is a ability to believe that the US is able to change, perhaps depending on the president, perhaps, using Americans to rally the message, giving us too much of the benefit of the doubt. And that was my, I wouldn't even say criticism, but that is kind of what I warn to the people in Russia in my own way, as not to dictate to them what they must do, but in the sense of coming from the West, but also understanding the consequences of Western intervention. And I know that they very well, in many ways, have also seen it. Being far too aware of the intricacies of what happens in the halls of Washington, I am far more critical of the US than any Russian has been to me or to the United States. I mean, we see it right now in the desire to find peace with the United States, to give them the benefit of the doubt, to throw an olive branch in spite of all of these things happening. It's just endless. And it's not just what's being laid out there. It's the back channel scenarios happening that do show that there these countries, whether it's Russia or China, are in many ways, or any country, basically in West Asia, are always far more diplomatic than is deserving of what I would call the perpetrators, the duplicitous, completely, in many ways, fascistic governments that exist in the United States and across Europe. And that's what I see the most. It's not a whole in this entire event. It was not about how awful even Germany was or the Nazis were. It was just we sacrificed this much. Here's what happened. Here's the history. Here's how it impacted us. This is how Moscow was bombed back then and how we stopped it from continuing. These are all the people that died. It wasn't, we hate Germans and we hate Nazis. That's not ever the focus, I think, from any of these countries.
Yeah, but it is obviously from the Zionists and from the huge
Of course.
majority of Israelis, which is, something that I don't know. People miss that point sometimes. That Western policy that is largely driven by the US and the UK is based on hate. Whereas their adversaries, if you want to call them that, it's very rarely couched in hatred. It's couched in, as you said, diplomacy, and their own national security. Tomorrow is the 80th anniversary of Victory Day, and it's quite interesting to look at the guest list, which of course includes, I think, the Israeli ambassador and Abu Mazen or Mahmoud Abbas, the so-called representative of the state of Palestine. Whereas, of course, we would all argue that he isn't accepted as such by the majority of Palestinians, both in the occupied territories and in Gaza, because, of course, he is nothing more than a Zionist puppet paid by the Zionists to actually carry out the targeting of resistance members and leaders, particularly in the West Bank, which is now being heavily targeted for final annexation and capture by the Zionist forces and the Netanyahu administration. When we look at that guest list, and I think Venezuela, President Maduro is going, I mean, there are a number of dignitaries. How indicative do you find it of the current Russian foreign policy?
Yeah, so initially I guess it didn't come out that Maduro was coming, but then it did, and he already met with Putin and he is here. So is Miguel Diaz-Canel from Cuba. So is Lula da Silva is supposed to be here as well. But what I'm looking at is the, Middle Eastern or West Asian um connections that Russia has. And as you mentioned, the Israeli ambassador was going to be there. But for example, as far as I know, Iran is not coming. Though Putin had a conversation with the president, Pezeshkian, and they talked on the phone on May 6th. And they
Yeah.
talked about, their strategic partnerships and yada yada yada, everything, the usual things that we hear. But I find it telling that you have Israel here, as well as, of course, Abbas, who, as you mentioned, is literally essentially might as well just have been another ambassador of Israel. And the thing is, when I look at Russia, and this is something that I did talk about the difference again between the North Korean
Yeah.
treaty, and then the one with Iran, it really makes a lot of sense when you understand Russia's policy towards Israel and Russia's policy in the region as being one of neutrality. The problem with that is that neutrality in this case is an acceptance to what Israel is doing. Because Israel is a type of entity that, very much like the Nazis during that time, were needed to be stopped, needed to be halted. It is a supremacist. It is a supremacist type of mentality, and that mentality is inconsistent. It is impossible to exist with any sort of humanistic approach, any sort of a peaceful approach. And so the Russian connection to Israel, which is something we've talked about, isn't something made up. It is something that is pretty much out there. I mean, we know that Trump and Putin agree that Israel needs to exist. We know that that this comes also because of the fight, for example, that the Soviet Union had against Nazis, right? And they consider this sort of thing that was also at that moment ideological, and it was something that needed to be done, and also the neo-Nazis in Ukraine. But what a lot of people miss is that Israel has consistently supported the
Yes.
Ukrainian neo-Nazis, that Israel has consistently been not just their own put out their own brand of Zionism, but supported Ukraine's brand of fascism
Mhm.
with these entities. And Zelensky, for example, being Jewish and also being the front man of the Ukrainian army, which is full of these neo-Nazi, neo-fascist entities, tells you everything you need to know. These are not opposing sides. These
Yeah.
are one and the same. And just because 80 years ago that things were different, and you
Mm.
could say that the consequences of that very much created the establishment of Israel. And there's that, there's that sort of, well, we fought the Nazis. We want to make sure this doesn't happen again, that, there's not anti-Semitism like this, but the Palestinians are Semitic people. The people that are being
Yeah.
slaughtered are Semitic people. It's so it's kind of jarring when you see it, because I think a lot of people, for example, here understand that and don't like in any country, like in the United States, any sort of involvement from Israel into a
Mhm.
sovereign country. But on the other hand, there is that desire to make sure that people understand that, anti-Semitism is bad, and it is, but it includes the people that are experiencing it right now. So when you understand why Russia is acting this way, it's not necessarily out of a malevolent desire. It is more of like, well, this is our history. We did this. We hated, the Nazis. We fought against them, against what they were doing to these people. There are, Russian Jews. There are ethnic Russians living in Israel. Okay, but things have sort of changed, but not really. It's kind of like we're still seeing the same mechanisms used against a group of people now for ethnic cleansing. We're just not calling it a Holocaust, but it is. And I think
Yeah.
people are afraid to say that, or even unable to recognize it, because it's not happening in Europe, and it's not happening with, you know, the Hitler regime. It's happening, of course, with the people, supposedly the
Mhm.
descendants of the people that were the victims years ago. So I think it's just very hard for people to wrap their mind around that, and that includes, I think, Russia. And it is a rather jarring thing to see that, because you understand it, but in many ways I just don't, I can't get with it, because it's like
Mhm.
there's so much going on right now. And I do see Russia continuing to be neutral, and because of the people they are bringing, and the just welcoming that they've given to the United States in other ways. I do see that there is going to be some sort of ceasefire or some sort of truce, an end to the Ukraine war sooner rather than later. And that will also affect what happens in West Asia, as you've pointed out, in Syria, and in that relationship. So
Mhm.
it also is worth mentioning, by the way, that there's gonna be the fourth round of U.S. Iran talks
Yeah.
on the nuclear program, on Tehran's nuclear program, and that's going to be May 10th, which is literally a
Mhm.
day after May 9th. So like between the 10th and the
Yeah.
11th. And so that's just cannot be coincidental to me.
Yeah. And I think also, you talked about this. I don't know, it's very strange. I mean, I've never seen Sergei Lavrov, for example, condemn Israel for welcoming literal Nazis into Israel, members of the Azov battalion, entertaining and supporting Zelensky and Madam Zelensky. But also, the fact that also not forgetting, Ukraine was in Idlib for at least the last 12 months of the former Syrian government being in power, training Jolani's forces, and yet Russia, was among the first to effectively normalize relationships with Al-Qaeda in Syria. I mean, this was something that I still find very shocking. I mean, for me, yes, there should be pragmatism in politics, but there should also be ethics and there should also be morals. And I think if you're fully aware in President Putin's statement after the fall of Damascus, he was perfectly aware that they had been fighting against Al-Qaeda. And many people saw his statement as, well, obviously they're reformed, or however he phrased it. Many people described it as an irony, but I don't think it was. I think he was genuinely paving the way to normalizing relations with Jolani, which is exactly what we saw with the arrival of Bogdanov, I think within 6 weeks of the fall of Damascus. And then, if you look at the Israeli involvement, even in Ukraine, in Maidan in 2014, there were actual Israeli occupation forces brigades fighting in Maidan against the supporters of the Donbass, and the fact that, of course, Zelensky would not be in place had he not been supported by Kolomoisky, and Kolomoisky, who has an Israeli passport, amongst his others, and the fact that really Ukraine was the cradle of Zionism. And so for me, I was actually thinking about this today, particularly after reading your article. We talked about the fact that there had been, for sure, ongoing back-channel negotiations between Moscow and Washington once Trump had been elected, before he was inaugurated, and before the fall of Damascus. And we said for some time that the fall of Damascus was related to these negotiations, and there was potential for a deal in Ukraine, and as such, Russia effectively abandoned Syria and left the field open. But I was thinking about it today. To do this, they would actually need Israel's influence, just as they've used Israel's influence in lobbying the US to not only keep their base in Syria on the coastal region, but to consolidate. And they've been bringing in a huge number of cargo planes in the last couple of weeks. So they're clearly building up their armaments and equipment there again. They're recreating the base that they had and actually expanding it. But that wouldn't have been possible without Israel lobbying the US. Now, understanding Israel's influence in the Ukraine, I actually wonder, and I haven't had time to go into it in any depth, but I wonder if the negotiations were actually with Israel and Israel was lobbying Trump. And effectively, what Russia has done, if you think about it, they've not sacrificed Syria for the United States. They've sacrificed Syria for Israel. And now they're collaborating with Israel to maintain their own presence and to push back against Erdogan's neo-Ottomanism, right? And that's very clear. In the last few days, Israel actually bombed in one of the largest bombing raids since the end of last year. They bombed Turkish proxies surrounding the Russian base on the coast. And Russian planes were circling, but they were not engaging at all. Were they providing coordinates for Israel to bomb those Turkish proxies that might present a threat in the future to Russia's presence on the coast? So I think, I think this connection between Russia and Israel goes far deeper than is being made visible on the surface. And while I think, yes, the Ukraine negotiations would happen with Trump and Moscow, I have a feeling that Israel would have been instrumental in actually enabling those negotiations on behalf of Russia. It's just something, when you look at the map for the last few years in Syria and beyond, and the connections between Russia and Israel that are now clearly deepening publicly. I do wonder if that is not the case. I wonder what you think about that.
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree. I have seen it in media. Suffice it to say that there is definitely a connection when it comes to Israel and some media in Russia, and showing both sides in terms of the labeling of it being an equitable approach to that, when in reality we know that the genocide was a genocide from the beginning, right? And it took some time, right, to for them to start calling it what it was eventually. But even so, in some of the rhetoric and some of um, the way things are presented, there is like a very soft approach when Israel has, for example, it's attacked or bombed. And this was way before. This was back in 2023 even, and before the October 7th attacks, during the time when they were attacking the many of the refugee camps in the West Bank. And there was just this approach to calling it, make diminishing what Israel was doing. But if there was a counterattack from a Palestinian or from, someone from the West Bank, it was called a terrorist attack. And it's these sort of things where I just wonder, that people need to understand the Zionism that impacts the US and that has impacted Europe and that has pretty much is destroying so much of West Asia, so much of attacking the resistance at endless on endless occasions, is also prevalent in Russia. There is that element here as well, and there's that element all over Eurasia. And I think people just assume, because there is more criticism, I guess, when it comes to the UN. Russia has criticized Israel in some ways, but it's always been under the era of, we need to resolve the conflict according to the UN Charter. This is why I mentioned the UN Charter in the article, because the Soviet Union had a much better military deal with the DPRK than actually even this one that Russia has. And that military deal was automatic with the Soviet Union. But with Russia, they still have the ability, with a specific part of the article it's conditional, and the UN Charter allows them to, via Article 51, basically, if they don't see themselves having an urgency to get involved with North Korea, perhaps if tensions escalate, there is sort of a way to get out of it, because of that specific UN charter aspect of it. So it's very interesting that you see a little bit of the differences here. There's that pragmatic side of Russia, because that treaty with North Korea, part of that is because Israel, North Korea has nothing to do with West Asia, right? Like they have a good military strategic partner that is not involved in any of the just what's happening in the region. And so it's easier for them to have that relationship. Whereas like with Iran, obviously that puts Russia in a position where it's like, well, if we have this relationship with Israel that goes far deeper than than they talk about, even, right? Then it's coming out more and more, but it's never been something to lean on until, as of recent, I've seen I agree with you that that it's gotten more obvious, and not just based on what's being said, but based on what's happening with Russia's foreign relations. So I wonder just how much that control extends, and I wonder, if people are aware of it. I think a lot of people that are talking about multipolarity and that are talking about it in a way where, basically labeling Russia as the Soviet Union, which it is not. Um, when they're talking about it in this way, they're missing that major factor, because you can't have, and I've said this before, you can't have a multipolar world in the sense of equity. You can have it in the sense of different factions of power. But if you're talking about it, being the reemergence of the oppressed countries in the global south, that has a limit when you have Israel in the picture. When you have the
Yeah.
Zionist entity, there is just no way that's even, it's a very big, huge elephant in the room. How do you
Mm.
go around that? I don't think it's something
Yeah.
Russia can ignore or will be able to ignore. I think this is
Yeah.
something we're going to be seeing unfold.
Yeah. And it's interesting what you said about North Korea, because actually North Korea had quite a historic involvement in Syria in the development of weapons and armaments. So actually, the North Korean connection is there in Syria also, which I don't know whether it would potentially be a stumbling block. I mean, obviously, right now they're not a very prominent player in the region, as you said. But it's also interesting that you pointed out in the article, of course, that it's now fully admitted that North Koreans are fighting with Russia in Ukraine. So that
Mhm.
bears out this idea that there is this article within their strategic agreement that they will come to the defense of their respective countries. Um, why do you think, I know again, coming back to your article, you talked about, the shuttle diplomacy that's been going on with the Trump golfing buddy and envoy Steve Witkoff, who's, I think, been 4 times to Moscow.
Yeah.
Um, and I think what is really interesting, and I picked up on this, even over Trump's rather panicked ceasefire with Yemen, which, while he's trying to play it as, the Yemenis didn't want to fight anymore, nobody on the planet, I think, believes that. I'm sure it's far more to do with the fact that he's got a Gulf country visit coming up on, I think it's Monday, and he didn't want to get bombed. I think that's one of the reasons involved in it. But I think another reason, and this was actually a headline in the New York Times, is that the Pentagon is actually worried. He's now, I think, lost over $1.03 billion worth of, I still have to giggle over the lost planes. One of them, one of them was actually shot down by friendly fire, allegedly. The latest one had arrestment failure, which sounds very much like a heart attack, while it was under Ansarullah fire missile attack, and basically ended up in the Red Sea while the pilots, got out, ejected. And the one before that, I can't quite remember what the excuse was on that one. But yeah, I mean, it's kind of amusing. So I think with the shooting down of the various drones and losing three F-18 Super Hornet war jets, I mean, the cost is now over 1 billion. And the Pentagon is basically saying, well, hang on, you're spending too much money battling Ansarullah and basically failing while we've got a war with China to think about. I mean, I'm paraphrasing what was said, but they were effectively saying, don't spend so much in Yemen because we've got China to come. And in your article, you talk about this, pivot away from West Asia, particularly Syria, resolving Ukraine, isolating Iran, and I kind of do want to bring in what's happening also in India and Pakistan, because of course that's on a huge stretch of border with Iran, which is clearly going to impact on Iran. And
Exactly.
we've talked about the potential for not only a direct attack on Iran, but also, an uptick in the hybrid war strategy to try and achieve destabilization, to occupy Iran on different fronts, because Iran is trying to broker peace between India and Pakistan for very good reason, because, a fire belt along that southern eastern border is going to be a disaster for Iran, and it's going to impact on that entire territory of Iran. So is this sort of closing, and I'm saying this without wanting to be cynical, but I think this is how Trump thinks. You know, he's given Netanyahu the green light to go ahead with the final solution in Gaza. We can talk about that in a bit. So he's basically washed his hands of the Gaza file. He's washed his hands, or he's trying to wash his hands of the Ukraine file. He's trying to wash his hands of the Syria file. What's this for? Is this to pivot to new conflict areas? And if so, what do you think they are?
Yeah, I definitely think you said it right there. I mean, I think we are going to have to see Trump close this down with Ukraine and Russia because it was a loss. And it kind of reminds me of Afghanistan, of post
Yeah.
Iraq, because it's just like they're trying to make it look like it's a win when it's actually a very disastrous loss for the United States and its allies. Kind of like with Yemen, right? With Yemen, it's like they're not admitting that they were massively defeated. Trump is just trying to make it look like, okay, well, it's good. We're resolving the crisis. We have very good news. Yet the Houthis want to stop bombing. They want to stop. Like, so it's just, it's always like from a position of, oh, see, look, we're resolving the issue. It's not from the truth. The truth is they lost in Ukraine, they lost and are losing in Yemen, and they're not going to admit that. So they're going to twist it into this PR game of saying, well, we're going to bring peace. I'm the peace president. And look, if Russia and Ukraine can't figure it out, that's not on us. And Europe, meanwhile, is just because they were so destroyed by this, because they were the ones that lost the most, not the US, but Europe. They're just so angry, and they've already gone in too deep. So they seemingly don't want to, in many ways, just give in that easily. But the reality, everybody knows that the United States is the puppeteers, right? They're the ones controlling everything. They're the ones that, behind Kolomoisky, who was giving funding that was the Obama administration. That was, Victoria Nuland. We can go all the way back even before that. But the thing is, in this way, they have more bandwidth to actually focus on Iran, to focus on China. And the United States simply cannot add the Ukraine conflict and can't afford to continue it. Not to mention the fact that I mentioned the minerals deal, right? Which is being touted as this winning card for Ukraine, that Ukraine now has more cards, when in reality, it is basically tethering Ukraine to being a colony of the United States. It is giving its natural resources that it has left, because Russia has a lot of those in the Donbass. It has very, very mineral rich areas now, and beyond. So what essentially is happening is that Ukraine is being robbed of its resources, and it's going to endlessly owe the United States money for everything that it gave it via this mineral deal. So it's not a deal for them. It is a terrible, terrible deal, if you want to call it. It is just a tethering into indentured servitude for the US. But many don't even see this. I think many people who think that this is a good thing are just don't even understand what's happening. And so in this way, I think it's going to be difficult for me to buy that the war will continue, because now the United States and BlackRock, which is also a US tied multinational corporation, have interest at stake. And if Russia continues to move in to Ukraine and continues fighting, it's going to interfere with these very profitable interests. So I don't think that's convenient for the United States. It's definitely not convenient for Ukraine. So I do think we're going to see a resolution for multiple reasons, for economic reasons and for geopolitical reasons. We know that Trump has to give some kind of win. He ran on this. He said it would end in 24 hours. Then he said that was a joke, that he didn't mean it, but that, they're working towards that. So he's got to deliver in something, because honestly, when it comes to the superficiality of it, his ratings are going down the drain. People are just not happy with him. A lot of the people who used to support him are going after him for what he's doing domestically, persecuting people, censoring. What Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is promoting the H1N1, I think, vaccine. It's become a circus of everything that he stood for. Is just that people bought into. That we warned you here wasn't the case,
yes.
but bought into it anyway. He's just being a comic book character of all of that, and actually doing very, very fascistic things. But he needs some sort of win, and I think that he will try to position this as a win, and therefore now the United States can focus on Tehran, they can focus on China, they can focus on the global South, on Latin America. We are seeing them increasingly go after Venezuela, increasingly go after, I think they have their eyes on Honduras's election. They also have their eyes on Nicaragua's election next year, and Bolivia as well, which is where there's a lot of lithium. And of course, that's what this administration is. What you mentioned is the full eradication of Gaza, the entire complete and dismantling of it in greater Israel. That's what Trump is here to do. He can kick the Russia can down the road, which is what I mentioned in the article, onto the next Democratic administration. But I do think that even when we do get some sort of conclusion to this war, it's not the end. And I think this is where I warn Russia. This is not something that ends with Trump. And I think some people in the Russian government understand that, and some people don't. And so a lot of the geopolitical analysts, a lot of the people who who come here, they really just stick to the political side of it, the government side of it. They don't understand like the historical side of it, and they don't really talk to the general population. And I think you and I both know that there's a difference between what the government does and what the government says, and what's actually happening, and also what people think, and the reality of situations on the ground, and that it differs greatly. And as a journalist, you have to get to know both. You're not just here to be whisked away on a private delegations of sorts, and like just to because then you only know one side of things. You need to know the broad general spectrum. And I see, based on my experience, even in traveling and in how things are being conducted, there's definitely a lessened animosity between the United States and Russia at the moment.
Yeah. And I think for people to understand what Trump has given the green light to, I mean, Israel is making it very clear. I did a summary yesterday on the UK column News, but it's effectively the driving of 2 million plus Gazans, Palestinians, from the north of the Gaza Strip, which, by the way, for people to understand, it's about 40 kilometers by 12 kilometers. It's already tiny for housing 2 million people. I was there in 2012. It was already incredibly congested. Buildings were just being built upon buildings to try and create the housing necessary for the population back then. This is now 2025. And they're going to basically push all the 2 million people into a strip of the strip, which is between, which will be completely encircled by Zionist forces all the way around. So between the border with Egypt and between what is being termed the Morag corridor, which separates the south of Gaza from the north. And in between that will be held these 2 million people. The north will be completely emptied. This is according to the Zionist plans. There will then be a reduction of the humanitarian aid, which at the moment is standing at about 600 trucks per day, which is still not enough. That's going to be reduced down to 60 per day. They're closing all of the humanitarian relief centers, reducing them down to 6, which are going to be managed by American private military contractors. And when you go to their websites, there's just a front page, nothing else. So that suggests to me that their intelligence or their special forces that are being brought in and have already been brought in to man the various checkpoints throughout Gaza and entry points into the different sections of Gaza that have been, divided, partitioned up by the Zionist forces. And added to it, there's going to be a system of facial recognition. So only approved Palestinians are going to be or have any access to food or humanitarian aid, while of course they're being kept in what will be the equivalent of an Abu Ghraib in a minute section of Gazan territory. And of course, the ultimate gain, which is for the Zionists in from their perspective, is the idea of the final solution, which is the final ethnic cleansing, because conditions are going to be impossible for Gazans to bear. And then bringing in the European Trojan horse strategy, whereby they'll be offering evacuation for example, EU citizens and their extended families, for injured Palestinians and so on. They'll also be coming in through the back door to pressure Egypt with EU funding to agree to the influx of a huge number of Gazan refugees. And there's also pressure being put upon Jordan at the same time. And so, what Trump has effectively done, as I said, he's closed the Gaza file for the United States. He's handed it over to Israel and given them the green light to effectively exterminate an entire section of Palestinian existence within what is left of Palestinian statehood in the occupied territories. And at the same time, of course, they're starting to whittle down what's left of the Palestinian settlements in the occupied territories, particularly in the West Bank. And so, as you said, Fee, we were saying this before Trump was elected, and we were getting shot down on social media by people saying it's only one issue. Well, where are the other issues that you thought were going to come to prominence, like Kennedy and his anti-vax stand? As you said, here he is bringing in a vaccine program, right? Trump was warp speed fanboy.
Yeah.
And when we're saying it's only one issue, no, it isn't. And that's becoming very clear. Palestine, if it is eradicated, it's the first and the major domino to fall. Because as we've seen, it's had the knock-on effect of what has happened in Lebanon, what has happened in Syria, what is now happening in Iraq with the increase in ISIS attacks against the resistance factions there, which was inevitable because we know that Israel wants to extend its presence in Syria up the eastern corridor, which they've termed the David corridor, which eventually will give them access to the Euphrates and potentially lead them to the border with Iran. And so, it's not one issue. That one issue is a catalyst for every other issue that US citizens are going to have to deal with because they ignored that one issue in favor of voting for Trump. And I'm sorry to say it so bluntly, but, we as human beings have got to start waking up to the connections between events globally and understanding that resistance isn't just about making sure you've got a gun, making sure you've got food and fuel in case something happens in your neighborhood or around your house. No, we're all connected. Everything is interconnected. Even what is now happening in India and Pakistan, what's happening between China and the Philippines, Nothing is coincidence. The world is basically being set alight, this is my opinion. And if we don't start making the connections very soon and stop looking for the lifeboat of BRICS or multipolarity and so on, and understand that no, the global governments, the transnational oligarchy are not thinking about multipolarity, as you said, from a position of equity. They're thinking about it from a position of power, from a position of national security, from a position of resource grab, from a position of territory grab, from a position of reinstating former empires. And if we don't fully understand that, then we're always going to be swimming in a much smaller pool than the one we should be looking at. Sorry, that was a bit of a longer statement than I meant it to be.
No, I just wanted to say regarding your statement a couple of things. India, Pakistan, you have Pakistan that has obviously more ties to Tehran in general, right? And then you have India that has ties to the United States and Israel. It has a good relationship with Russia, but again, it's a very there's that Zionism that's there in India and that support to Israel that's extremely strong. So that is not coincidental what is happening as you mentioned, even for those basic generic reasons. Now, I want to point out something that you said about the um, obvious green light to destroying Gaza. Back in February, I wrote an article about how the ceasefire was essentially going to lead to all of this. And I talked about the Abraham Shields plan.
Yep.
And what is unfolding now with Israel is basically that, essentially. It's essentially this idea of taking Gaza and closing down the front and establishing a transitional government, which would be controlled by Israel, having the U.S. Military there, right, and having these forces getting rid of Hamas as much as they can, and of course ensuring that Israel gets all of its all hostages returned, and really working with the United States to secure this dismantling, quote unquote, dismantling of terrorist infrastructure that they wanted. And of course, the moderate Arab states, which we're talking about, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, will also help in quote unquote de-radicalizing this. These are the words of the Israeli Zionist regime.
Yeah.
And essentially create whatever's left of Gaza, eradicate it all, have what's left be dispersed, as Vanessa laid out, but really also push for the attempt to destabilize more and more of Lebanon, to continue to distance Lebanon from Iran's influence. That's also part of it. And to continue, of course, distancing the entire region from Iran, from any sort of resistance access, and essentially take over. And that is, again, it's supposed to be this Abram alliance between Jordan, Egypt, Israel, the Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Morocco, Sudan, and other allies that are pretty much in line with Zionist Israel and the United States. And we already knew that they were going to try to use Egypt and Jordan for this very same thing, right? And they're going to force them to do this. And so everything that's happening now was essentially laid out way before this, even before October 7th. It's October 7th has been the excuse of to basically increase in speed and what they had laid out, what they had wanted to happen. And anybody that questions this, of course, is going to be deemed a terrorist, whether or not they are a part of Hamas. They already are. And it's essentially, it's what's happening in Israel. And I remember pointing this out. What happened in Israel before during COVID and what's going to be happening and what is happening to Palestinians in Gaza and all around the occupied territories is essentially could be in the future, very near future, come to any sort of Western city, whether it's in the United States. And I think I have to point this out because sometimes this is the only way people in the West understand, whereas it pertains to them. This is something that it just like with Trump using the border crisis to pass more surveillance, more censorship in an effort to, defeat the migrants coming in, all of that is going to use to muddy the waters. Um, when you have refugees, what that does is it creates animosity towards the refugee rather than the ones causing the refugee crisis. So,
Yeah.
in the same way we've seen the animosity go towards people coming from Haiti, people coming from, Latin American countries under sanctions and blockades by the United States, whether Venezuela or countries that have suffered destabilization in Central America or Colombia or Cuba. You have this sort of hatred against these people, right? And you also have the weapons and arms deals that have been pushed on a lot of these gangs that have been given to them by the intelligence apparatus of the United States, particularly the DEA and other facets of that nature that continuously funnel weapons to these uh, really paramilitary gangs to create violence and sow this type of thing. So then Americans, or in this case of Europe, now that this is happening, and it could get much worse with Syria, with more Palestinian refugees, with any refugees from the region, it's going to allow this sort of narrative of the radical terrorists and paramilitary gangs coming through the borders of XYZ, right? And then so now your focus will be on these people and on crackling down on these people instead of understanding what caused this in the first place. And so we're going to be having to wade through these waters and trying to find the nuance of all of this, because we've seen the endless refugees come from West Asia because of the war in Iraq, the war in Afghanistan. We've seen the crisis coming from Venezuela. All of this is used against to foment more hatred towards these countries and manufacture consent for more war, saying, oh, Iran is sending their terrorists and so on. So I think we also have to be on the lookout for that, because that is also coming as Israel continues to expand, unfortunately. And I'm not trying to be dire about it, but it is unfolding, unfortunately, as we said back in February.
Mm. And I think, yeah, not to forget that Jolani, the head of the HTS Al Qaeda junta in Damascus, imposed by Turkey, Israel, the US, and the Gulf states, is effectively promising normalization with Israel. He was recently visiting France and was given a presidential welcome by Macron, which I think was one of the most humiliating days for France's history. Really just unbelievable. But I think Jolani at that point made a statement that there were ongoing negotiations between Jolani or Syria and Israel, with the UAE, of course, acting as mediator to try and end the Zionist aggression. But of course, he's made, I mean, even before the fall of Damascus, HTS were making statements, public statements, that they hope to see an Israeli embassy, a Zionist embassy in Damascus. There are currently Zionist journalists wandering around Damascus and so on. And it's very clear Jolani is acting as a tool of Israel, well, both Israel and Turkey, but Israel is taking dominance right now. And so, there is a danger that Syria is going to be dragged very unwillingly into this normalization complex, which, as you said, is headed up by Qatar, UAE, Morocco, Sudan, and with Saudi Arabia kind of playing on the edges, you know, making claims of wanting a Palestinian state before it normalizes with Israel. But of course, the fact is, the reality on the ground, they're already normalized, as is Egypt and Jordan, of course. Egypt since 1979. Now, I think to some degree this is going to be the downfall of Jolani from two perspectives. One, he's betraying the Takfiris that he brought under the umbrella of HTS from a perspective of not being extreme enough, because now, of course, he's having to basically appease his Western management and controllers. And secondly, with the existing Syrian population who are being submitted to extortion and rape and child trafficking and massacres of all factions that are not bowing down to the Takfiri ideology. But the final straw, I think, for them, because in Syria, it's always been known that the enemy is Israel, right? From childhood upwards, from the street sweeper to the taxi driver, to faith leaders. It's always been known. Israel has always been the enemy because of their solidarity with Palestine, but also because of the threat to their territory, which we're now seeing unfolding. And so I think, personally, I think Jolani's days are numbered, because he's in a very precarious position from a multitude of angles. And I think the US has made it very clear that it's not going to continue supporting them. I mean, I think we talked about this before, the interview that Jolani gave to, I think it's New York Times. But there it was very clear that the US had basically washed its hands of this file also, and was saying, no, like, go and get your weapons from Russia, because we're allowing Russia to keep its base in Syria. But the quid pro quo is that Russia's going to have to help you out militarily and from a reconstruction perspective, right? And so is Turkey. So, to some degree, America's done what it always has done. It's destroyed a country, and then it's just left others to pick up the pieces and to deal with the appalling aftermath. And so for me personally, I don't think Jelani's going to be around much longer. Whether his end is going to come through what is a growing resistance against him from within the Syrian population, or it's going to come from competing and confrontational factions within his own HTS conglomeration of Takfiri mercenaries, of course, 50%, I think, of which are foreign. Yeah, so it's kind of it's very interesting times, and it's becoming very difficult. And I think we've talked about this before we started this, analysis is becoming stressful. And it's becoming, there is a sense of just being overloaded with information and with rapidly developing situations globally. It's no longer kind of focused on one area, when it used to just be Palestine that we were talking about, or it used to just be Syria or Ukraine. Like, everything now is sort of snowballing into one conflict, which is being run by, and this is what I wanted to end up on. I loved what you said in your article about who truly pulls the strings in the swamp. So I'd just like to end on, we are snowballing towards multiple conflicts, whether it's hybrid war, whether it's direct confrontation. Who's pulling the strings on that? Who's leading us to this?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a difficult question to answer in terms of, the entire world, but I think in terms of the United States, it's what many on the Trump end called the deep state, but what that really essentially means is just the underlying military industrial intelligence apparatus. And
Mm.
that's the driving force of the existence of the United States. It is the reason we exist. We export war and resource extract, and that's how we survive. We don't make anything, and that is what's been running the show for quite some time. But now what you have is the multinational wealth I think we talked about last time that I think is
Mm.
popping up in many countries that seem to have similar interests. And I'm not just talking about Davos because that is definitely um, very much one end of it, or the Bilderberg group. It just goes beyond that, I think. And there's definitely an element of, in my opinion, if we want to simplify it into the most simplistic terms, we're fighting a fascistic takeover by
Yeah.
those in power. If we want to really put it in terms where people can understand, I don't think fascism ended. I don't think it does end. I think it transforms. I mean, I think for it to end, we would have to really get beyond the certain point that we are, because I believe lessons repeat until we learn from them. And I think that what we're
Yeah.
seeing is develop now, 80 years after World War II, to kind of come full circle here, is the same type of ideology in Zionism that existed with the Nazis. It's the supremacist ideology, and it's that ideology that is being used under the mantle of Judaism. It is being used to essentially resource extract, take over, and completely abolish the human existence of all of us. I mean, we if we have allowed something like this genocide to happen, and how in this modern age we have been unable or unwilling, because not enough governments have done what Yemen has done and directly attacked Israel the way they have attacked. That's what's required. But,
Yeah.
we have been just completely dumbfounded and manipulated to use the identity politics aspect of what it is to be anti-Semitic, right? And so in this sense, it's become it's been used against us, and Israel has been protected and Zionism has been protected. And Zionism could be um, Israeli, or it could be a Christian, it could be anything, because it is a fascistic ideology. So I'm not just even talking about, the religious aspect of it. I'm talking about what's behind that. And ultimately, it's not the religious aspect. It is ultimately the ideological aspect that is a driving force in the world right now, and they only use the religious aspect to get away with it, to self-victimize, and that's why it's so hard to fight it. And even well-meaning nations, or nations that are being weaponized themselves, just don't do enough against what's happening because of that. So it's in many ways we're at a worse scenario, because the enemy is almost untouchable in
Yeah.
many aspects. And so we also have the victims in West Asia,
Mm.
a region that many have been um, curated and propagandized to believe exists in violence because of the very people who live there, and because they were just born into it and they can't get out of it, not because of the actions of
Yeah.
the our governments and the evil suits that sit in power. So I think it's very difficult to explain that to people, I think, and really get into the nuances. As we've seen in social media, people only like the sensationalist type of lack of analysis. It's just, sensationalist news. It's not, there's no going deeper into it. And so they're not really getting news. They're just getting bits and pieces of copy paste from, so on and so forth. And I think it is our job and our duty to try to sift through this for people and have conversations like this where we at the very least try to find some clarity in all of the mess. And even if we end up with more questions after the fact, I think at least eventually we will get to scuffling through some of that.
Yeah. Well, Bea, thank you for taking the time out to speak to me again. It's always good, very cathartic exercise. And I hope other people enjoy the conversation as much as we actually do also, because it's hard for us to catch up sometimes with everything that's going on. Where can people catch up with you and find your work?
Yeah, really trying to get my Substack up and going. So if you can find me on Substack, Fiorella Isabel. I just wrote this article that we went over today, and we have more things coming. But yeah, you can also follow me on X or Twitter at Fiorella Isabel M, and also on Telegram, Fiorella in Moscow as well.
And on YouTube?
Yeah, and on YouTube, I also stream on Truthwire. See, Vanessa, thank you for reminding me.
All right. Thanks very much again, Fee. And we'll speak again very soon to catch up with what's going on, especially as things are so rapidly changing. Thank you. Take care.
Bye.